Hello folks, it's Ranger Billy, and now we're going to go to part 2, the new construction. So here we are at the old Spanish Quarry. Now we're talking, it's 1565 and Ponce de Leon comes here. He claims Florida for Spain, and now over the next few years they build like 9 wooden forts. All of them get ransacked and put on fire, or they rot. So they have to find a better material. They have a guy named Pedro Menendez Marquez, and he's the one that's actually the one that finds the coquina. And they get with a man named Ignacio Diaz, and he's the one that actually is the engineer for the Castillo de San Marco. And he does, it's an amazing thing. So what I didn't tell you guys about in the last segment was about the Anastasia Coquina Formation. So now the Anastasia Coquina Formation, it basically runs 60 miles west, 300 miles east, and 250 miles south. So anywhere you dig, you're gonna hit this coquina rock, okay, when you dig down 2 to 6 feet. So they need this new stone that they're gonna build this new fort with, to be able to safeguard Florida and safeguard the Spanish throne's new area. So in order to do that, they have a big process, and it's 3 different things that they have to go through. So the first thing they do is they get a guy to oversee the quarry, and his name is Alonso Diaz Mejia. And you know, the good thing is that if you go behind Anastasia Baptist Church over on Beach Street, you can actually see his home is still there. And that's his chimney, and that's his well, okay? And it's still there, it's still standing. It's made of coquina, of course it's still standing. So anyway, he comes here and he's got to put together a plan. So they get the money, and next thing they got to do is they got to get workers. So they get Cuban workers that are prisoners from Cuba. They work off their time. They can either stay or they could go back, unless they got 20 years, then they're going to be here for the whole project. The other thing they get is they get 3 different Native American tribes. The Timucua, they get the Gaul, and they get the Appalachian Indians from Tallahassee. And they actually pay them 1 real a day, which is a whopping 12.5 cents a day, which is a lot of money back in the early 1600s, I gotta tell you. You may not be able to buy a mansion, but you'll be able to trade some stuff with it. Anyhow, so they get all these different groups together, and they start making tools. They need to make stone cutting tools. They need to make, the carpenters need to come in, and they need to make trows and flatboats and oxen carts, so that this way they could get the coquina from here over to the Anastasia, over to the downtown St. Augustine, the Castillo de San Marco site. So what they have to do is, if you look behind me, you'll see a lot of scrub oak, a lot of palmetto. What you don't see is a lot of snakes. There was a lot of rattlesnakes. They had to drive them out. They had to hew all this stuff down by hand. And then they had to dig down anywhere from 2 to 6 feet just to get to the stone. Once they got to the stone, then the skilled workers would come in and they would actually chisel out the stone. Small pieces, large pieces. Some pieces they actually needed 6 men to get in with crowbars, pick it up onto the ox cart. Then the ox cart would go ahead and take it, and there's a little creek right next to the alligator farm here in Anastasia Island. And that creek is called Escalta Creek right now. Back then it was called Quarry Creek. And then they would actually take the stone and they would position it on the flat raft, and then they would float it over to the Castillo de San Marco site. Now I have a little map here. So basically we're here at the quarry. So they would actually take it, ox cart it over to the creek, and then take it from the creek over to the Castillo de San Marco site. Then they would take it off there, and they would actually take the stone where the stone cutters over there with the masons would actually fine tune it and then leave it for a whole year to dry, because coquina has to dry. Now during this time they had to actually use a cement for this as well. They had to use, if anybody who knows bricklaying, you actually have to use some kind of cement to actually hold the bricks together. They don't have cement, so they have to go and utilize what the ancient Romans did 5,000 years before them, a process called quicklime. So what they did was they gathered bushels and bushels of oyster shells, right? And they took them. Now, if you know oyster shells, they are pretty thick, okay? So there's no way you can bust them, okay, by hand. So they go and they get, in the first year, 7,000 bushels of these things. And they build what they call a lime kiln. So they build 2 of these just north of the fort area where it's at now. And they heat that up to 2,200 degrees. And then they put these in for 12 hours and let them heat until when they come out, you can actually just crumble them up in your hand. And it's kind of like a white substance. Then they add water in it. That's why they call it quicklime, because then they add the water in it and it becomes a putty. So the chemical process is basically, it takes out the carbon dioxide out of it. So now you're just left with CaO, okay? So that takes that out and it becomes a putty. Now they have to let that sit. The Spanish actually let it sit for a year. The Romans let it sit for 3 months, up to 3 months. The Spanish let it sit for a year to get good, because you have to realize it's actually going to form between the coquina. Now also, while that was happening, then you had all the men up at the site, at the Castillo de San Marco site. So after that year was over, they started laying the stone and they started putting all these up. In the first few years, they got the first 3 sides of the fort put up, and then they had to stop because they ran out of funds, and it became a situation. The whole process was just very difficult. People got sick. It was very easy for people to get sick back in that day. There wasn't penicillin. They didn't have the kind of medicines that we have today that would be able to help you out. And if someone got a scratch, it was almost a life sentence if they got an infection. So this process really took a long time. So from here, this quarry, and also where the amphitheater is, that's where they took over 400,000 stone to build the Castillo de San Marco. It's just an amazing story. And what we'll talk about next week is we're going to actually talk about the history timeline and then the human factor that went into what happened here at the quarry, up at that Castillo de San Marco, and at the kiln site. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next week.